Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Children, Families, Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The first item is appointment of chairman. Mrs Wright was nominated chairman-elect at the County Council meeting held on the 17th of May. Could I ask the committee to confirm that this is agreed?
So moved.
Excellent. Unfortunately, Mrs Wright couldn't be present today, so we're hoping that the Deputy Chairman will chair the meeting. And the next item is election of Deputy Chairman, so please could I have nominations?
Can I nominate Mrs Richardson? I believe it's Terry's daughter.
May I second that, please?
Excellent. Thank you, Mrs Richardson.
First of all, may I welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everyone please switch their microphones on when speaking and then turn off when they finish speaking? I have received apologies from Mrs Wright, with Mr Jennings acting as her substitute, and Mr Sheehan, with Mr Hunt acting as his substitute. I have also received apologies from Pat Fraser, Health Watch representative. Unfortunately, we do not have any nominations for Parent Governor representatives. The posts will be re-advertised for November. We move on to item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of March 2017. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on 6th of March are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Are you all agreed? Yes? Okay, thank you. Item 4, question time. I've received no questions from members of the public. And item number 5, questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions from members. Item number 6, I've not been notified of any urgent items to be decided on this agenda. Item number 7, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. I'd like to remind anyone, for example, who is school governor. Yes?
I'd like to declare that I am an assistant Senko as school governor.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr Walsh.
Yes, I'd like to declare that I'm a school governor, that 2 of my children work as teachers, and 1 of those runs the South Leicestershire Autistic Unit.
Yes.
May we as district councillors also declare a standing declaration that we keep on records in order of our position as district councillors? So we do that at some other meetings, you know, just in case anything comes up, i.e. like supporting families or whatever. So, you know, just to note.
Okay, is that taken? Mrs Taylor.
Just that I have a step-grandson that is under care services in the city, which might cross over into the county, so just that you're aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that all declarations? Thank you very much. Declaration of the party whip in accordance with Overview and Scrutiny Procedure Rule 16. Do any members have any declarations? No? Okay, thank you. Under item 9, presentations of petitions under Standing Order 36, there are no petitions today. So we'll move to item 10, which is the quarter 4 2016-17 performance report. This will be presented by Stuart Smith, Business Partner for Performance and Business Intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you. The report for quarter four, it isn't an end-of-year report. It's mainly activity within the quarter, just to draw people's attention to that at the moment. The overview is 29 measures that have new data available. So, for example, the education data will be last year's and not much would have changed within that. Occasionally we get some comparative data, but we've got 29 measures that have new data. 10 have improved, 16 show no significant change, 3 have declined. I'd like to draw your attention to the social care indicators on the dashboard, part 1. There are now no social care indicators within the 4th quartile, which is indicated by red, which is positive movement across the year. We have several greens now, as we can see from the RAG rating. Green shows either top quartile or upper 2nd quartile positive movement. The red RAG rating is bottom quartile or 3rd quartile with negative movement, as indicated at the bottom of the dashboard, the colour coding. One of the highlights is the children who find the report being looked after, being issued with a child protection plan for the 2nd or subsequent time, which the department have worked hard on during the year because the figures were relatively high in previous quarters. We're now in the top quartile by available comparisons. Previously we've been in the 4th quartile, so that shows quite significant movement. As I previously mentioned, the education hasn't changed because we're expecting new data next quarter when the exam results are in. The one outstanding area was the education of children in care, where we did have some local data, but the national data hadn't been produced, and we were asked at the last scrutiny meeting to bring that if possible. That's now available. The Key Stage 4 performance was better this year in Leicestershire compared to previous years. We have been in the bottom quartile in previous years. We're now, I think it's the 3rd quartile, but it's a very tightly bunched. We're very close to the national average, very close to statistical neighbours, using the Progress 8 measure, which is the headline for Key Stage 4 performance now. In contrast, Key Stage 2 performance wasn't as impressive as last year. Last year we were top quartile. Now the quartiles haven't been published because a lot of LAs have 5 or less children who reach the grade, which means it's suppressed data. I think there's 150 roughly local authorities, of which 100 didn't have data published, of which we were one. But our local data indicates that we're below the average in that. I think that's the main highlights from the report for this quarter. As I said at the start, there hasn't been too much significant change this quarter, just the social care data has been, because that's always refreshed quarterly, education data less so. Any questions from the members? Thank you.
Mr Jennings.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. It's always interesting to have statistics as a councillor. I appreciate it. But I'm looking at part 2, and towards the bottom, it says Key Stage 2, percentage of pupils eligible for free school meals achieving extended standards in reading, writing and mathematics. I don't see how the two are connected. To know how many children get free school meals is one thing, but to associate it with achievements does not seem logical to me, or perhaps even proper. Could somebody just explain why that is so, please?
Thank you, Chair. We use this as a measure to look at the performance of children that we would consider more vulnerable against those children who we would consider mainstream. So the figure that you're quoting is how we compare the progress of those young people against progress of those young people who we wouldn't consider vulnerable. So we use the definition of free school meals, and the children that are eligible for free school meals are those pupils who would be more disadvantaged.
Still don't see the logic, but I accept that. Thank you.
Mr Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if it's possible, can you go to page 16 at the top of the page, and it talks about sufficiency. It's absolutely amazing what can be hidden by statistics. In Oadby, there is a scandal brewing, and the scandal is the number of pupils of infant age that can't get in the local schools. I don't know whether it's because we've got academies in all schools, but we're in a situation now, I understand, that there are adequate places on paper for the number of children in Oadby. But the problem is that if you happen to be born at the wrong time or move into Oadby at the wrong time, the school places are filled up with all the children that live along the London Road in the city. So the question I would wonder if we could try and look at is the number of primary school pupils who live in Oadby, got Oadby addresses, parents live in Oadby, who have to be transported all across the county, I assume by taxi, because the schools are more than 3 miles away, and are desperate to get into Oadby schools. Now, I don't know whether this is because of the academy system, but if you happen to fall in the wrong catchment area in Oadby, we've got families of 3 children being transported by taxi to 3 different schools. And we have an even bigger scandal that if people want to send their other child that could get into a local school to the same school, even if the taxi is empty and is going there, they charge for the other child to go. So if you've got 2 siblings, one has to go to a school halfway across the county, and you think, well, it's better if I have 2 children going to the same school, but that child manages to get in one of the Oadby schools, you have to pay for the cost of transport. So I'd be interested to know what the cost is of transporting young people across there, and in fact, how many young people have refused entry to local schools, how many appeals there have been, and how many have been won, because I've just been knocking on a lot of doors, as I assume a lot of us have, and this is something that is really big time in Oadby, and really something has got to be done about it. Thank you, Chair. I feel better now.
Can I ask if anyone wants to come back on that, or whether that's something to bring at another time?
I think the situation would be, obviously there's a lot of data that we've got to pull together on that. We're more than happy to do that, and we'll come back and pass the information on to you or bring back to this committee if that's required.
Mr. Ord.
Thank you, Chair. Last year of the last council, we organised on a district or borough council basis a meeting for people to come and talk about and hear about the demographic trends that were going on in their area. It's fair to say that the majority of councillors didn't attend. That exercise will be repeated in this forthcoming year, probably sometime from September onwards, and I'm sure that we'd welcome Mr Kaufman coming when we get to Oadby and Wixton, and we can take up the issues with him.
Thank you. Mr Jeff Welsh.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'd like to come to the social care block on the statistical layout. Firstly, to say I really welcome these figures. I think now we've had 2 or 3 quarters where we've seen some consolidation in performance and improvements in all the categories. Considering how hard we struggled a couple of years ago, it's pleasing to see these performance figures achieved. One of the ones that interested me, because we were most concerned, was the type of accommodation we were putting people in when they left care. And the figure now is quite stunning. It really is good. And I just wonder whether officers could perhaps tell us what sort of initiatives have been achieving this sort of performance, or is it merely a matter of gathering the data in a more correct manner?
Thank you, Chair. I think there's partly yes to the points you've made. So we now have a really rigorous way of collecting and checking the data. And for this group of youngsters, on a monthly basis, the relevant service manager goes through child by young person to check some of the data. We do, this is a quarter, as Stuart outlined earlier, so we do know that over the year we need to keep a really close eye on this group of youngsters. It has been by close working with colleagues in housing, it has been by close working with the individual young people to ensure that they are in suitable accommodation, and it is and has been by working with colleagues, with the partners around those issues that many of our care leavers have.
Primary schools to sign up their school to that particular mat, and by doing so that gives the children at that school and the parents a lift up in the admissions criteria. These schools are not the ones that are necessarily closest to that school, and it's having quite an impact on schools round about. Parents are complaining because the school I work with refuses to join in this. Therefore, it means they can't get into that particular school, and it's going to go quite a long way. I can see it coming. Other city schools have signed up, so they immediately, schools in the London Road area, the children at those schools do get a movement up the criteria and probably get themselves in before schools that are geographically closer to the other schools. So it's something to watch out for.
I think obviously the relevant information will be sorted and passed back to members. Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions, but first of all, may I point out that we are looking at the performance indicators, which is strategic and not individual personal ward issues. I think we ought to very much separate that. Can I ask two questions on the actual layout? Which ones of these are local indicators, or are they all national statutory indicators? Could you confirm that for me, please? That's question number one. Secondly, having been doing performance checking performance indicator for adult social care, I'm surprised that this being, we are all talking about consistency and continuity and whatever, and we have got a total different system with children and family performance indicators than we have with adult social care. So why do we have two different systems? Why don't we have one system across the board for all our indicators? Because if you're looking at adult social care, it's a whole different format. And the other thing which I'm getting very confused, yes, it says better or trend charts and whatever, but it doesn't tell me whether my percentage should be high or low. So if it is similar or lower, yes, fine, I understand it's lower and the trend is lower, but should the trend be lower or should it be higher? That doesn't come clear, you see. So you could have a green indicator, but it still isn't performing as well, if you see what I mean. And also, under social care, 1, 2, 3, 4 down, we've got a green collar, but it also says A for amber, so there's just a mistake in there. But could you just answer my housekeeping questions, so please?
Would someone like to come back on that? Stuart? Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the ones which are statutory, that there isn't a clear flag when reading it. For the ones with statistical neighbour averages are the ones which are to say that there is other national data available, which therefore means they are collected statutory by the government and submit and published. All the data in our column, which is the current performance, is local in-year data. That's not what we've submitted. This is our progress against the targets that we've set. In answer to the higher or lower, we did change the language to say better or worse to try and avoid that issue of saying higher or lower and not being clear if that was better or worse. So we've tried to say this is better, this is worse, regardless of whether it's gone up or down, because, as you quite rightly said, some would like to see go down, some we'd like to see go up. Was there one more question?
Well, if I may come back, Chairman, yes, but your chart doesn't indicate to me whether should be high or it should be low. So therefore, in order to make it effective for us to evaluate, we need to know whether it is supposed to be high or low. So that should maybe indicated by an arrow up or down, so we know. It also would be extremely good to know which one is the national statutory indicator by maybe asterixing it or whatever, because otherwise, because we've got to ensure that I assume it's funding related. So if we don't, say for instance, have the percentage for children in supporting families, we wouldn't get the funding. So we got to keep the eye on certain performance indicators. So, and my other question was, why haven't we got the same here as we probably have in adult social care? Why don't we have a standard format?
Mr. Meredith.
So I understand that we've had various formats that have operated in this committee over time, and there's been adjustments. I mean, Stuart may know better than myself in terms of this. This is the agreed format that was agreed by the committee some time ago. So I think we're always open as officers to look at different systems in some ways, but I understand there's been significant changes around that side of things. So this is a system that we've operated now in all the time I've been here, and I take your point, but these charts are very small, and try and keep them concise. The amount of information that you can put in is sort of limited. So we can always talk outside of meetings if you want further clarification in terms of where we are. But I think we feel that the lines that are driven here gives a clear indication of the trends that are actually operating at this point in time. Why don't we operate the same system as adults? The problem is that, as Stuart has said, this is a mixture of national and local targets. They're very different from adult services. We're looking at different things in different ways. So it would be extremely difficult for us to operate a similar system to adults, because often you're looking at completely different criteria that we're looking at. Most of the basis of these indicators here have got a statutory basis behind them. They've got law that's informing them in some way or another, and that often isn't the case in adult services. So I think it would be very difficult for us to operate a system that was exactly the same as adults.
Thank you, Paul. I do notice that it does give us the national benchmark quartile besides. So, Mr. Gould, I believe you want to come back.
Yeah. The DFE and Ofsted are quite different from the way that adult social care is controlled and inspected. And that's one of the major reasons why there are differences between the collection of statistics in the two departments. We've now got trend charts, a trend bar, which gives you a very visual indicator of whether it's going up or coming back down again. And in addition to that, the third column along actually has a word in better, lower, similar, or even worse, which I think does give a good indication to people as to the direction of travel. So at the moment, until Ofsted and the DFE and whichever department controls adult social care in Whitehall get their heads together, we'll have to make do with the differences.
Mrs. Taylor? No. Oh, you're all right now. Dr. Bremner.
On page 15, item number 17, it's the children in care with up-to-date immunisations not yet available. I would just like to ask, what is the different standard determined based on the child's date of entry into care? What does that actually mean? And when would that data be available?
The paragraph was put together after speaking to the head of service in the area. I don't know the confirmed dates other than that health is after our figure. So although we do have some local figures that will be indicative, we're reluctant to release those without them being seen by health and agreed to by health. It's quite dangerous to do that, I think, without health confirming that with us.
If I can add from a practice point of view, we're currently doing a piece of work with colleagues in health who are working through with us all our children in care and checking all their immunisation records. So by next time, we'll know exactly who's had what. Yeah.
Thank you. Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. My question really is centred around the number of SEND appeals lodged between 15 and 16, which obviously is historical data, and yet it said it's been updated, but that might just be the way it's collated. And it's 10,000. It's 3.15 per 10,000 of the school population. That doesn't necessarily help me because, one, I'm not sure of the school population, so I can't work it out. But it doesn't indicate to me whether these appeals have been upheld or whether they've been dismissed. And I wondered whether there was something separate from that at all. Thank you.
Thank you. The update is that some national data was released. It's 2015-16. There's always a lag in the collection of this and the publication of it. Last week, actually, there was some new data on SEND appeals, which I don't have to hand, but I'll be happy to put that together. Some more detail about the SEND tribunals, appeals, statements that were granted and not granted. A variety of data has been released last week, I think it was a fortnight ago, by the DFE, which I'm working on at the moment. Happy to share that. It's publicly available data, so I can provide more on that.
Thank you. Yes, sure. Thank you for that, because as I say, it tells me that there's 3.15 per 10,000 of the school population, so it's higher, but it doesn't tell me, as I say, this information here, whether those have been upheld or the reason why the appeals are being dismissed. Would the data that you're talking about supply that information to me about why the appeals have been dismissed?
Without looking at the data, I'm not exactly sure of the indicators. I can't recall seeing the reasons on the nationally published data. Paul?
I was just going to say, I mean, obviously you're interested in what's happening locally, yes? The per 10,000 figure is a normal comparative figure that we use in a lot of things, obviously, to compare with other authorities. In terms of the detail, actually, what would happen, we would have to prepare a separate report for you in terms of the appeals that went there and what happened to them and the outcome. And I'm sure that we could do that, Jane, at some point, and provide that information to you locally. I think it'd be very small numbers that we're talking about anyway.
Mr. Hunt?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, there's a lot of good news on this, and I think reference has been made to that. I think when we look at the performance figures, we often look at the bad ones before we look at the good ones. So congratulations to officers and Ivan for all the good work that's been done. When I started to look at this, I looked at the reds, all the bad ones, if you like, And I have to say that there's some difficulty in getting consistency between schools sometimes, and there are new schools and so on. But that led me to look at page 16 and the data referring to the vulnerable groups, that's paragraphs 26 to 30. And generally, that didn't look such a good picture as the overall picture. And I wondered, therefore, I suppose the question really is, well, first of all, as someone relatively new, certainly new to this committee, as I'm substituting today, whether this links into the Ofsted report, whether the Ofsted report covers this area. But more specifically, where we're not doing so well, I was a little bit surprised not to find the reasons why down here, and it would be awfully helpful next time if we have, particularly where we're not doing so well, what we're doing about it. So it was, in a sense, why we're not doing so well on these figures in the vulnerable group section, and what we're doing about it. Those two things. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. We can provide some more detail around why we're not. What we do know, and we've done some quite thorough analysis of our performance across all of our schools' data, and what we do know behind this is a number of things. One is that our progress at Key Stage 2 isn't as good as we would want it to be, considering the number of good and outstanding schools we have. And some of that we think is about our two-tier system, which will be ended in September, where children transition from year 5, between year 5 and year 6, which is obviously a crucial end of Key Stage 2 time. So we're hoping that once that system has changed, that results will change accordingly. We do know that across all of our key stages, there are a number of vulnerable groups that don't do as well as they ought to be doing, and we're doing some further work with our colleagues across the education sector. That's our primary heads, secondary heads, teaching schools, multi-academy trusts, to look in more detail about where we're not performing as well. So we have drilled down in a number of areas of these data sets, and we know that pupils with special educational needs support plans, we know that pupils who are more disadvantaged aren't performing as well as they do, and we also know that we've got some areas of particular where we're not as particularly strong, so areas around girls in maths, for example, and boys with writing is an issue as well. So there's more of a backstory to all of this, so we can either provide some more detail to the next performance report or bring something in more detail around our education quality performance in general.
Yes, Mr. Gould.
Chair, I'm very conscious that at least 2 members, if not 3, of the committee have made the point that raw data with a trend is not really an adequate explanation as to the background behind the figures. It's not confined to you, it's also encompasses me as well, because in my lead member meeting last week, I was actually asking for the data in terms of a more up-to-date report than the one you've got in front of you. I do think it would be much more useful if we could include a small commentary where there are any significant changes, and we'll undertake to have a look at that to try and help people. An awful lot of new people around the table who haven't been used to seeing this type of information. And I think the point that you made about what was the number of figures of SEN appeals that were successful or that were dismissed, providing there are no data protection issues in that, I can't see why we can't provide that information as a matter of course. So we'll undertake to go and do something about that.
Thank you. I think that would be most welcome, especially to the new members. Any more questions? Then we'll move on to item 11, young carers. Jane Moore, Assistant Director for Education and Early Help, and Carly Turner, Service Manager for Supporting Leicestershire Families, will present this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm presenting today, alongside my colleague Carly Turner, the work that's taking place to identify, assess and support young carers across Leicestershire. And you'll see from the report that we're estimating there are around about 2,000 to 2,500 young carers across Leicestershire and Rutland at the moment. And that you can see that we have also provided some data about the number of young carers nationally. During the last financial year, the County Council did undertake around about 150 assessments of young carers, and as a result of those assessments then went on to provide a variety of support to those children and their families. And some of that's provided through our Supporting Leicestershire Families service, but actually the majority of it is provided by other organisations, some of whom we commission and some of whom we work through. You'll see at paragraph 6 that we're really pleased that we've got a memorandum of understanding which has been signed by both children and adult social care, but also our Director of Public Health as well. And that sets out a number of key principles. It also talks about how we ought to identify children, but also whose responsibility it is around assessment, providing information, advice and advocacy, thinking about how we support those children transitioning to adulthood, but also our safeguarding responsibilities as well. So you'll see at the top of page 26, we've talked about our assessment of young carers, and we currently commission Barnardo's to undertake those assessments for us. And as a result of those assessments, and Carly will give you a little bit more detail, we do provide a range of interventions to support those children once assessed as well. So in the last quarter of 2016-17, we did have 53 young people who were referred to the service. And as you can see, that does exceed the target. So we are doing well in terms of meeting and identifying those young people. And then finally, just to take you to the paragraphs around achievements in Leicestershire and also the opportunities and challenges. We're the first organisation or first authority to have the Memorandum of Understanding signed by not only the two directors of adults and children, but also the Director of Public Health, which is a significant move in terms of the engagement of health services for these children. We've also worked with the Young Carers Trust. That's meant we've changed the UCAS to the University Application Form to identify whether those children are young carers or not at point of entry to university. And we've also done a huge amount of awareness raising around young carers across education, which has led to the introduction of champions within schools. And finally, you'll see that we've identified a number of opportunities and challenges and actions that we need to continue to do. So we know we need to develop a much longer term strategy in order to continue to meet our statutory responsibility around young carers. We do have a carers network which is chaired by adults and communities, and their next focus is going to be around young carers. And then finally, there continues to be a challenge around the identification of young carers and making sure that people are aware of when a young person would meet the criteria for being a young carer, but also making sure that they have access to that assessment that then points them towards the support that they can get following that. So I'll just hand over to Carly, who's going to talk a little bit about the intervention we do with young carers.
Thank you. We've, in relation to the work from Barnardo's, we've got a two-pronged approach for young carers. So once they've received their assessment, they're either offered some form of group work that's either run by ourselves through Supporting Leicestershire Families, through Young Leicestershire, or through Barnardo's, and they're based all around the county. And what they do is offer young people respite away from their caring situation to do some of those activities that they ordinarily wouldn't get the time to do. So that's the kind of lower level intervention. And where assessment tells us that we need something different for other young people, there is an intensive support package that runs for 6 months through Barnardo's with their workers. And what they do is they complete an assessment on an outcome star, which is the U star. And so they're working with young people to look at what their hopes and dreams are, their well-being, their choices and behaviour, how they communicate, their education and work, and making a difference. And so they complete a holistic assessment and work their way forward with that for those young people to start to ensure that they're achieving the outcomes of young people that aren't in caring situations. I've got a couple of case studies from Barnardo's which I think are always useful to have a look through. And so we've got a young person from North West Leicestershire, 13-year-old. They were referred to Barnardo's because they've got no friends, so they're socially isolated. Their school attendance was low due to mum's ill health, challenging behaviour at home and at school. Emotional health and well-being was being impacted upon, and there were issues of racism and prejudice. And so the work that was undertaken, they completed the initial assessment, and the young person then received some advocacy in school. So they addressed the racism and prejudice and the bullying. They had some one-to-one work sessions around self-esteem and confidence. They were given one of the young carers' ID cards, which they can show to confirm that they're young carers and receive some additional support. They receive some talk-to-talk therapy and were referred to a young carers group for the respite work. Their parents were referred to adult services for a caring assessment as well, because we know that that whole family dynamic has to be addressed. And there were some emergency planning meetings around messages in a bottle, and they identified that actually the young person would like to do dancing, and so the young person goes to a dancing class as well. So there's lots of successes in that. Was one of the more intensive pieces of work that's been undertaken, and so the young carers, we also understand the young carers' voice, and they've expressed feelings at assessment about the impacts of the caring role upon their own health, and so they were listened to by the Bernardo staff, and they're still kind of trying to unravel that to make sure that some of those people that are in the caring and support arena for that young person work with that assessment as well. So then just one final thing as well is we're interested in what young carers have to say, and so next Monday actually we're running a Young Carers Voice event, which is at the Space Centre, which we're inviting all young carers and their families to, and we're going to ask them some real poignant questions about how they feel they're involved, what they would like to, how they feel they're achieving, what they would like to, what they'd like us to take into account as well when we're looking at any recommissioning, and we're hoping that that runs really successfully on Monday, and also gives young people a nice opportunity to go and visit the Space Centre as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're hearing quite a few very positive steps from officers today. We always focus on the negative, but it's nice to hear about that as well. Mrs. Page.
Thank you. I think this authority is doing a wonderful job, and this report highlights it, and I think we're all very proud of this. But one of the issues very much is that the young carers we identified, they're the ones who are quite astute in a way, but how about all of the young carers who don't actually see themselves as young carers? So how can we reach them, and what are we doing? That's question number one. And my second question is, as we commission it out to Bernardo's, how do we check and monitor, and then at the end, feed back to improve on their ways, because we are ultimately, just the commissioners. So if you can answer those two, please, and well done. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. In terms of how we're reaching hard to reach young carers, that's actually quite difficult, isn't it? So we are reliant upon the circles that we've set up around the schools coming together, and around how they share information and identify some of those young carers within school and bring that to our attention. We're embarking as part of the plan on working with GPs as well, because we know that they're quite crucial in the identification process, and so that will form some of the work that the multi-agency group are looking at going forward. And then just in terms of checking and monitoring Bernardo's, we do have quarterly monitoring meetings with expectations for those. So in paragraph 8 of the report, that was a report based on quarter 4, and we would expect to receive the whole year overview of that, and we do hold them to account if they're not performing. But actually what we know is they do a lot more assessments than we require of them. So we're reasonably quite happy at the moment with the Bernardo's contract.
May I just come back? And what has the long-term support these young carers get? So, the permanent underpinning of their personal health.
Thank you. I think we probably would need to look a little bit deeper with some of those, and I think the event that we've got on Monday will allow us to really get to those young carers, because I guess essentially they come to us and we never meet some of those young carers because they go to Bernardo's, and it's a lot about how we now choose to engage with those young carers, and Monday will be a real poignant time to do that, because we've never consulted in that kind of forum with our young carers, and but again we're hopeful that the message has gone out, and that young carers that are more hidden and more difficult to identify with will appear. But we do seek voice work through Bernardo's, and we will make sure that we follow up on some of these case studies so that we get a longer scale view of the positive impact of that.
Mr. Ord.
Thank you, Chair. A number of years ago, about 4, we didn't have anything like we have now. And when I asked the question, how many young carers were there in the county, nobody could give an answer. That seemed to focus attention into this area. And I then went to the Lakeside, which is the local NHS partnership, where the Young Carers card was launched. I've also visited Bernardo's and taken part in one of their group sessions with young carers. I would, as a health warning to all members of the board, ask you to look at paragraph 17. There are young people out there who are carers who do not wish to be identified as carers, in some cases because they're afraid they may get taken away from their families and taken into care. What you've got is an indicative figure. I don't know how much is under the surface or how much is above the surface, and I keep an open mind on this, but to see where we are today with the achievement that we've got with the Memorandum of Understanding, and to hear Carly talking about the event on Monday night is an awful long way in 4 years from where we were before.
Thank you. Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. Just a quick question about the young carers and how they're coping with their education and what targets they're hitting with their education, because there's no information here about, it's a lot about the social side and how they're coping with their families, but nothing about their educational needs and how they're coping and hitting targets with that, please.
It's not something that we monitor actually in terms of a vulnerable group, so it's a really good question. Because we don't monitor education data for that group as a whole, it's not a group that we've got information on, we're not able to answer that question. So I think it's a really good question because it's not one that we're monitoring regularly for those young people.
Is that something that we could look at? Because I think that's quite important as well, that, you know, socially and health-wise we're monitoring them, but their educational needs is something that's quite important for their future life and as they move forward. So is that something that we could look at, that we could get some data on, please?
Yeah, we can look at the possibility of whether we can gather the data. One of the issues is, as we've pointed out, that part of the issue is the ongoing monitoring of these children and young people and their outcomes. So we can do monitor at the beginning in terms of the assessment, but often it's not the local authority that then continues with the intervention with those young people, which then makes it very difficult for us to gather data. But it's something we can look at to see whether or not we can get it, yes.
Mr. Welsh.
You know, just reflecting on that question, I suppose we have to take care not to be seen as a bureaucratic element to the young carer's life, and that we're there as a support. I actually agree that I'd be interested in knowing, does it damage their education? But I think there's a fine line to tread between being there ticking boxes with young people rather than being seen as someone who's there to support them and advocate on their behalf. Why I asked to speak was to thank Carly for the report, and I particularly like the touch of giving us a little case history in there to give us an idea of what does this actually mean to young people. So thanks ever so much for that, and it sounds as though some really good things have been happening, and it certainly looks as though in finding Bernardo's as a partner has been one of the best steps forward, so thank you very much.
Any further questions? OK, we'll move on to item 12, the extended free childcare entitlement. Jane Moore, Assistant Director for Education and Early Help, will present this item.
Thank you, and I'm joined by my colleague Sue Wilson, who heads up our early years service as well, who's going to provide some detail on answers. So the report that you've got in front of you provides two things really. One is an overview of the work the department does around the implementation of our extended offer, but it also gives you an overview of the work the department does in general around our 0 to 5 provision across the local authority area. So the local authority, we've got a duty to secure sufficient and high quality childcare across Leicestershire, and the service that Sue is responsible for delivers and commissions support to those providers that are judged to be less than good by Ofsted, but we also provide a range of advice and guidance to all providers in the county, as well as parents and carers as well. And you can see from paragraph 2 that currently in Leicestershire, 94% of all of our childcare providers achieve a rating from Ofsted of good or outstanding. And in Leicestershire, the market is dominated by private, voluntary and independent providers. We have a responsibility to administer and monitor the take-up of the free early education entitlement, and that's for eligible disadvantaged 2-year-olds, and also for the free early education available to all 3 and 4-year-olds. And you can see that our take-up of those places is at 80% for all eligible children for the 2-year and at 95% for those 3 to 4-year-olds as well. And the service also ensures that children in care access their free early education entitlement as well. So in the Childcare Act 2016 introduced a new statutory requirement for the local authority, and it was that from September there must be available an additional 15 hours a week of free childcare for those parents, working parents who are eligible. And so what this essentially does is double the current universal entitlement that's at 15 hours now. The 15-hour entitlement for those most disadvantaged 2-year-olds still remains in place. In January 17, the Department of Education invited Leicestershire to become an early implementer of the extended entitlement, and we agreed. And we agreed that, based on the view that early implementation would allow us to have a much longer period of introduction in order for us to really have a look at the sizable change ahead. Because there was significant ambiguity both around demand but also around the provision of childcare across Leicestershire as well. Paragraph 10 outlines for you what the new eligibility criteria is, but Sue's service did quite a lot of work around estimating the number of parents in Leicestershire that would be eligible for this new entitlement, and they estimated that there would be between 4,500 and 4,900 parents who are eligible for this extended entitlement. So there was a whole raft of work that took place in terms of preparing for implementation and then at point of implementation as well. And those were around looking at our sufficiency analysis, so looking at our current provision and whether or not we needed to think about developing more. We did a huge amount of work around eligibility checking, work with our local providers, and also work with partners around preparing for implementation. And you can also see at the top of page 32, all councils are required to establish a local inclusion fund from the dedicated schools grant to support 3 and 4-year-old children who have special educational needs or disabilities who are wishing to access that extended offer. And then you can see we did some work around IT development so that we have mechanisms to validate those claims made by providers, and also starting to think about the monitoring of the impact as well. And you'll see in paragraph 7 that we have identified some risks or potentially adverse impact of the extended entitlement as well. So in terms of progress to date, since the decision to become an early implementer, we've made really good progress. So 71% of our providers have indicated that they would be willing to provide the extended offer. The service that Sue heads up has dealt with 4,600 families who've received a unique reference number that they can use with their chosen provider. And really positively, the Department for Education have praised the quality and planning of work in Leicestershire, in particular the promotional materials that have been produced by the service, and they've shared these across the country as good practice as well. So just to conclude, really, despite really challenging timescales, there's been some really good progress made in the early implementation of this extended offer. And as a result of some of the really excellent partnership work that's taken place, but also some really strong communication across the sector that's enabled us to deliver that early implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Sounds very good, having gone through the early implementation and the pilot scheme. There's a lot of positives there. Can I just ask one question before I throw it out to the rest of the membership? You state on the bottom of page 31, about the additional places. Could you explain how you came to make the decision to put these places in Charnwood, Hinckley and Oadby and Wigston, please?
Okay. The local authority could only put 6 bids towards the Department for Education, and there was a very tight time frame. And initially there was a pass or fail criteria that providers could choose. And so we have 6 that we put. 2 are on a school site, and we looked at if those providers had waiting lists, what their occupancy was, whether they already had 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. And then we also looked at the census of where there were working parents, so we knew that they would be eligible for the 30 hours extended entitlement. So when we looked at that and we looked at the sufficiency, then we put forward their bid towards the DFE, who then had the ultimate say of whether they would take on and fund those providers.
Okay, thank you. Mr Welsh?
Yeah, just a bit further on that. What type of... Obviously, it's government money we're spending on these providers. Are we actually funding private commercial organisations that are profit-making?
The provider had to put 25% towards the grant themselves and then pay VAT on that. And then the DFE, so the local authority doesn't put any money in, it's DFE who puts it all in, so we're not funding anything as a local authority.
Canon Lewis?
Thank you. It's great that 71% of Leicestershire providers are prepared to extend their offer. That's fantastic. But can you give me some idea about what analysis has been undertaken of the geography of that offer? Because I'm thinking that's great if you're in a market town. What about if you're in Red Mile or Sheepy Magna? What's the availability? 71% sounds great, but that might be coordinated, focused on a particular area. Thank you.
So when we sent out a census in January that all providers have to complete, we did add some additional questions on there. And at the moment, because of the way that it was worded, in the summer term, that's when most providers are actually full, and they saw it as being whether they were going to actually take it on for this term. Whereas when it becomes national rollout, it will probably be more, because when we've actually unpicked it, that's when there will be more vacant spaces. But we're also starting to look at a blended offer. So although it looks like it's 30 hours, we're trying to encourage providers to offer maybe 17 or 18 hours, or maybe during the summer period, so they're supporting parents to go back to work during the summer holidays, or if they could work with the out of schools, or whether they could work with childminders. So it's trying to look at not just them offering it in their entirety, but to work with other providers to offer the 30 hours.
Mrs Page?
Yes, thank you. I'm a bit dim here now. You have to explain it to me. So what we've got, it is free childcare, 15 hours for early learning. So this offer now for disadvantaged parents has been up to 30 hours. So question first, how do we know they need 18 hours, 30 hours, 24 hours? So how do we determine that? And, what happens if we say, well, you can't have any more than 15 because you don't meet the criteria? And then what happens? Does somebody take us to an appeal? So I need to get my head around that. Now, on 10, it adds... more eligibility. Is that on top added to the original eligibility? So will that widen the scope of need and the possibility of more parents coming forward? So then the next question is that there is an income gap of £100,000 for one or more parent applying. So what you're saying is if a family who meets these criteria, they can have an income of 200k, they're still eligible, but is there then another mean test? So say, for instance, if they have £1 million in the bank and, £1 million house, are they still eligible? Because this is now, I think this is under the Care Act, isn't it, that it's gone up to that. But anyway, explain that to me. And Louise asked my other question. Oh, and it said that all of the additional cost is met by the DSG and whatever. Now, is that sustainable? Have we got a time limited on that? Whereas in many cases, like the 101 number and, whatever, they give us so many years and then they cut the finances. So are these finances and a long-term arrangement, or will we have to, in some years to come, fund this out of county council funds?
Okay, there are, to answer the first question, all children get 15 hours of universal funding.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there is an HMRC checker. So although this first term, parents phoned in the local authority because the government didn't have the HMRC checker in place because we were an early implementer, from now on parents will have to go to the HMRC eligibility checker, which will do it automatically for them. And then parents can use up to 30 hours. So if they don't want to use all their additional hours, that's up to them.
Yes, but they do have the 30 hours.
They can,
full stop.
They can use up to 30 hours of funded childcare.
Right.
Yeah. But so they can use 16 or up to 30. It's up to them. Okay, they don't have to use all of their 30 hours. Okay, and then the 100,000. It's not. It doesn't matter how much money they've got actually in their bank account. It's how much they're actually earning at the time. But that will be part of the HMRC checker that does that for them. And then your last question was about the funding and whether that would affect us. It's all on participation funding. So however many children are actually taking up their hours, the DSG, the DFE pay it on how many children are actually taking up their hours. Okay. So it's paid the term after.
Okay. But
so we
that
won't be in
is
deficit.
Sustainable. That isn't just time limited.
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Taylor.
Just a bit of clarity, please, on page 30 at 10, where you've got the estimates of people that will be eligible is between 4,500 and 4,900. Is that for the free entitlement for disadvantaged 2-year-old children, or is that just for the extra additional 3 and 4-year-olds?
That's for the extended entitlement for the 30 hours for 3 and 4-year-olds.
Any further questions? Can I thank the officers? There's a lot of good news in there, a lot of positive things going on, and obviously work in progress with some others. Date of next meeting. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on the 11th of September at 1:30. There are no urgent items, so I thank everybody today for attending. Thank you. Meeting closed.
Congratulations, Madam Chairman, your first outing. Well done.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.